Hey guys, welcome back to another Q&A. It is December 16th, 2020. All right, so let's see what we have this week. All right. So somebody asked, when running IGF on your Bloodwork or blood panel to check the quality of your GH, is there anything close to a standard number you'd like to see? Also, is there a protocol that works better than others, i.e. pen 8 IUs 1 to 2 hours before the blood draw? Okay. Might not give you the answer you want on this one, but the problem with using that IGF serum is, well, there's a few things. So one, how is it administered? You're getting a serum level, right? So an intramuscular versus subcutaneous might vary a little bit because you might get a little bit more localized IGF with the intramuscular. Also, how well do you even produce or convert to that IGF anyhow? It's not a standard thing. Like, you couldn't take one quality of a one purity or quality of a product in the same dose and give it to two people and get the same IGF, because the amount secreted is going to be different, right? So it's not really a good, it's probably not really a very accurate tool to use. Third, you would need a baseline. Like, you would probably need some kind of baseline, and even then your baseline may vary. So even if you had a baseline that was whatever number, and you saw, and then you went in and you did the protocol like you said here, yeah, if you saw an increase, that's a good sign, right? But how much increase, there's no way to tell. I mean, you would expect a more of an increase with more of a dose to some extent. Probably there's gonna be a ceiling there somewhere, but to some extent you would expect that, right? But to say as a percentage is not really any very accurate way that you can measure it. So yeah, it's really just not a great way to do it, and there's really not any foolproof way that you can go in through a lab and do a serum test like that and get a good outlook. Your best bet's probably an HPLC test to actually see what it is, or if wherever it's from, if they're doing HPLC testing or whatever, stuff like that's probably your best bet to really know what it is and what you're getting. Look at other people that may have done that, so on and so forth. So that's, if you really want to do it that way, yes. Now, otherwise, you could go in, have a baseline, and then expect some increase, and then if you did more, expect some more increase, type of thing, right? But as to say it's going to increase at 30% or whatever, it's not. There's just no way to tell, to be completely honest. There's just too many variables there. So I've seen people take different dosages and increase nothing or a lot with the same product. I mean, it's probably not the best way to figure it out. And frankly, like I said, there really isn't a very good way to figure it out. So next, all right. Things to look into for causes of insulin resistance outside of the typical causes: diet, body fat level, inactive lifestyle, etc., and approaches to reverse it. All right, well, your diet, body fat level, all those things are probably your typical stuff. It's really very lifestyle driven, right? Other things, if we're talking about, depending on what population we're talking about, so if it's the bodybuilding population, growth hormone could drive it up some. Also stress. Stress is probably going to be one of the most acute drivers that you're going to see a big variance, as well as digestion. So probably stress and then GI are probably going to be your two biggest things that are going to skew blood glucose. Now, are those driving direct insulin resistance? In you know, in like a day, like if you, let's say you have a stressful day and you see a higher blood glucose, is that driving insulin resistance? Yeah, I mean, to like some minute 0 point whatever percent, probably not significant if it's not a regular thing. But if you're stressed all the time, you better believe that you're still releasing glucose. So no, you're not consuming it, but you know, as a hepatic function, you're releasing it. You're still taxing your pancreas because it's constantly having to release insulin to compensate for this, you know, this extra glucose release. So yes, it is, you know, it is going to contribute to insulin resistance along with whatever else in the, you know, in the program or in the lifestyle is contributing. So yeah, so those things like sleep, stress, GI, you know, like all those things are definitely contributing to it. If they're chronic or if they're like happening regularly. So for sure, those are factors. And frankly, those things probably contribute way more than they should for a lot of people. Medications could be one. There are certain medications, always check on that. We had one the other day. This person was prescribed an antipsychotic, Seroquel, pretty common one. It actually drives blood glucose quite a bit, depending on dose, and it also will drive you like raising triglycerides and things like that. So, you know, be aware of like any other medications potentially if the person has any. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, those are probably like your main factors outside of what you mentioned. Now, in terms of approaches to reverse it, well, fix those things. The medication thing may be a little bit different, but as far as the, you know, as far as like the stress and GI and all those things, I mean, that's going to be the biggest thing. I've posted about this multiple times and actually shown a couple case studies of like people having massive differences in blood glucose. I had one girl that like literally cut her blood glucose in half. It was like 160 and we brought it down to 80 or below, so less than half, just from stress reduction and fixing gastrointestinal issues that were going on. Granted, it took a while, but she was actually eating more food when we were done than when we started, you know. So yeah, those things can drive it quite a bit. That's not a common scenario, but those things definitely can drive it quite a bit. So yeah, I mean, those are the things that you're going to want to fix. And also, even if they're contributing to a small extent, like it's still contributing to that overall insulin resistance that's going to build over time, that will shorten your potential for, you know, muscle growth and things like that. Because really, that's one of the limiting factors in our muscle growth phases. We get too fat, we get insulin resistant, right? You know, our gastrointestinal tract gets too taxed. Like, all these things are generally the things that are going to slow down or stop those phases. So the more we can manage those things, the more potential we really have to grow in a long run. I'm always looking at muscle growth as like, what's our biggest potential window? Not just like how much can we grow in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, like how big can we make this window and continue to grow through the whole window, right? Because that's really where we're going to make the most progress, you know, because it's really a slow process anyhow. So we got to think about like, what are these factors? How do we control them? So yeah, that's more of a preventative thing. I mean, how are you actually decreasing it? I mean, things like this, that's a big topic. I don't know if I can cover all that on here, but you know, things like eating less carbohydrates, that might work for somebody, even though you eat the same amount of calories, you replace with fats, you know, or protein or whatever, but it might not. Like, there comes a point where insulin resistance is at a point where you have to just eat less. You have to eat in a deficit. Some people, higher fats tend to contribute, right? Some people it's higher carbohydrate, or, you know, depending on what like ratios of macronutrients we're doing. Yeah, so it really depends on how deep you are into those things. If you're doing all that stuff perfectly, you're still insulin resistant, then yeah, you probably just gonna have to clean things up, go into a deficit. If it's maybe not too far gone, you can do things like fasting periodically to help stave it off or help reverse it to some extent. You know, if I have somebody eating a ton of food and we're way deep off season, they're not too fat, like we have a little more room we can work with, then we might do like a 24-hour fast occasionally just to kind of keep things in check. Probably the quickest way to help is not eat food, right? Now, one caveat there is sometimes when you do that, you will your body will increase production of hepatic glucose, or I should say secretion to compensate for blood glucose. So sometimes I do see people with higher blood glucose fasting than they do not fasting. And that's partially like a stress-driven thing, like how much they produce cortisol, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, it just depends on how far gone it is, really, is what you have to look at. So I hope that helps. I mean, I would, if you're kind of not sure, I mean, you could always try the things like the fasting and moving around ratios and things like that. If it doesn't work, then you pretty much know, like, hey, we gotta, we're gonna have to back it down for a bit. Okay. I understand it may vary from subject to subject, but what are general guidelines of androgen escalation from TRT cruise to peak blast dose? How long should the ramping be versus steady state at max load? And how much increase week to week? Since I assume that if a cycle finishes at X milligrams a week, it has to take time to get there, yes, and not jump straight there, since one, maybe I'm wrong, but when people say 16-week cycle X and Y, it's actually 16 weeks flat dose. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, that's traditionally what it's going to be, 12, 16, whatever, go straight up to dose. You're there, then when you're done, you're done. Now, if you're talking about an escalation scheme, this person may have heard us talk about doing this on like the OPD podcast, probably. There's no set way. Like, the whole point of that escalation scheme is to escalate when needed. That's kind of the point. And yeah, it's going to be long. I mean, it doesn't have to be longer. It doesn't have to be longer than any of these instances, but it can be, because the total exposure to androgens is lower as you're working up, right? So it might be a longer period, but the total exposure might be lower, or maybe just the same, or whatever, depending on how long it is. So how quick you go, like I said, really it's more of a as needed type thing. So if you started at, whatever X number of milligrams from the base, 300 total, I don't know, whatever, right? And you ramped up 100 or each time or something like that, just really depends on the person, and depends on like when it's needed. It could be 2 weeks, it could be a month, right? You might stretch it out a year. You might stretch it out 12 months if the person's not going to get fat and insulin resistant and not able to eat any more food by the time it's over. You might be able to stretch it out a pretty long period of time, and it still the exposure to the androgens is really not any higher than your 4-month, 16-week traditional blast, because you've escalated so slowly. So there was such a longer time under that curve, right? Or whatever. So, yeah, as needed when you stall. That's kind of the point. Just like food, just like anything else. When you stall, or when your progression is slowed multiple times, maybe not every time you stall, you might just need more food, but something that you have to get a feel for over time. But no, it's not going to be do this much I mean, you could, if you wanted to, an escalation scheme like that, because you weren't familiar with doing it or you weren't comfortable doing it. Yeah, you certainly could say, every week we're going to go up this much till we get to whatever, and then that's it, right? You could do it that way, but you don't necessarily have to. It can be more intuitively done, and in increments that are needed. So just depend. I would say that probably really depends on experience level. All right, I think we got one more here. I did have two more. One I actually already answered to the other person, so we're gonna skip that one. And yeah, the other one was on another video. So next one, favorite movement for tricep development. Okay, it's a good question. So yeah, triceps, so we got to think, the anatomy of the triceps are split up into a few different heads. I mean, traditionally, like, people use things like extension, where it's like a rope extension or things like that, which is fine, but we sometimes lack the ability to fully initiate the long head of the tricep on the back, right, or the underneath, or however you want to say it. So you might need some different movements in that case. Now, I think when you think about not only anatomy, but sequences of movements, right? So elbow integrity, things like that. So some of your compound movements where you might use like a close grip press or a close grip pin press or a JM press, or even like an overhead extension or something where it's maybe a little more on the elbow, you probably want to be more warmed up, you know, further into the sequence. Now, yeah, so consider sequence, right? And then probably consider just at least a movement for each like anatomical position of the tricep. So you're hitting, you know, whether it's something like you do a rope extension here and then you do an overhead rope extension, or you do a rope extension and then you do a cable, overhead cable extension, which I really like those, or you do some kind of press down, whether it's rope or bar or whatever, and then you do a close grip press or a JM press, or like a kettlebell rollout press, or, you know, dumbbell rollout press or whatever. Like there's a lot of ways, but yeah, consider that sequence and then consider working it from both of those angles to hit the different heads. And then of course, like you can look at your personal development. If there's like a part of the tricep that's not activated, then you could prioritize that either first, or you have a stronger part, prioritize it second, or that might move it around within the workout or whatever. But yeah, you'd probably prioritize the section of the tricep that does not work well, you know, or does not activate well, when I'm looking at the movements. Because really in your, like, for example, in the movements that we're trying to really hit the long head more, which can be challenging for some people, you're still hitting the lateral, you know, the lateral head of the tricep. You're still using it, right? Anything that's really extending at the elbow, you're using both, right? So that's not to say that you have to do both. So if you're long head of the tricep, you want to get more, you know, you're flexing, you're doing your front double bicep, you want to get a little more meat underneath, that type of thing. Yeah, I mean, you could just focus mainly on those movements that are working the long head of the triceps. So your presses, your JM presses, your overhead extensions, your overhead cables, your stuff like that. Even your, even if you have a cable and with the arms locked in the back position, extension behind you, this extension is really good movement. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, you don't necessarily have to do both. You're still going to hit all the heads of the tricep in there anyhow. So probably focus on those movements for that weak area first and foremost. The strong area is going to get secondary work regardless. So yeah, I hope that helps. In a couple ways you really want to look at the tricep work. But yeah, I think that's it. Like I said, the other question was already answered on well, there's two other questions. One I answered here and one was already on a podcast. So we were cut down a little shorter, which is fine. No big deal. Thanks for the questions, guys. I will talk to you next time.